So this is a math class, but this is not going to be a math lecture. This will be something closer to philosophy. We'll have lots of pictures instead of frames. It's necessarily going to be an idiosyncratic presentation. People mean a lot of different things when they talk about complexity, and this is basically my take after thinking about and reading about it for a few years. My background is mostly in biology, so most of my examples will come from that sphere. And I'm going to cover a lot of ground. Hopefully I'm not going to make any glaring mistakes, but that's possible. So I should probably take what I want to tell you with a grain of salt. The purpose of this talk is to give you a little background and to get us all in the mood to delve into the details later in the course. So we'll start with this diagram. This was created by Brian Castellani at Kent State. This is available on Wikipedia. And it basically puts complexity science into chronological and conceptual relation with a number of other intellectual movements and fields. The field of complexity is actually broader than just complexity science, which is listed here. There are many philosophical tie-ins, as well as a number of deep and quite fascinating connections in literature and history. I mean, for example, we have like Paul Sliers over here with postmodernism. Just the connection there. Taken together, I think all of these represent a broad trend in modern thought. And that trend is toward recognizing the importance of context and contingency in understanding our world. I'll explain what I mean by that a bit later. Mostly, I am going to focus on complexity science, as represented here. Complexity science is a field associated with the study of complex adaptive systems, which we can define as tightly integrated systems made up of multiple interacting parts that adapt to their environments and show system-level properties. I'll highlight a few of the related fields on this diagram. We have general systems theory here in the 1940s, 1950s, associated with Ludwig von Bertalanffy. This was an interdisciplinary movement focused on covering what he called isomorphisms, which is just a fancy term for strong analogies, between systems of different components in varying fields, different fields. And it was a focus on similarities of form, formal similarities, that is, mathematical similarities, versus on details of parts, with a recognition that systems can display properties at the macro or global level that don't exist or that aren't predictable from the micro level, so-called system-level properties. Another important field that's related is cybernetics, contemporary with systems theory. Came out of war efforts to do like control of missiles and that kind of thing. Associated with Norbert Wiener and Ross Ashby, among others. And this field dealt with the study of control processes and feedbacks. And it had an explicit focus on trying to model the mind. It was very influential. They grew into things like, say, artificial intelligence, agent-based modeling, the genetic algorithms over here. And then a third one I'll mention is dynamic systems theory. So that's the mathematical discipline that tries to understand the dynamics of nonlinear systems, and associated topics of fractals and chaos, which we'll go over in more detail. I think complexity is the latest systems movement, which has been enabled primarily by the rise of computers. Many of the ideas associated with the field of complexity have been around a long time. But now, through simulations and through numerical solutions, we can begin to explore nonlinearity in all of its gruesome and sometimes quite beautiful detail. Here's an example of what I mean. The new vistas that computers have opened up. This is an early map of the solutions to the logistic equation. Very simple equation. But then with computers, you can actually begin to get at the incredible richness of structure in the solution space. And you can zoom into whatever level of detail that you want. One of the key lessons of the field is the enormous amount of complexity that you can get from simple interactions, whether that's in terms of interacting variables in a very simple equation, the logistic equation, or individual agents in simulations operating according to simple local rules. And conversely, many things that we consider complex display some hidden order. So back to history, I think it's a bit misleading to just focus on the 20th century. Actually, it's just the last half of the 20th century, because the field of complexity has antecedents that go way back. And there are many, many examples of people I could have highlighted. I'll just mention a few. There's Henri Poincaré, who is a famous mathematician who studied nonlinear dynamics before it was cool, came up with phase space mappings, among other things. We have John Stuart Mill, around the same time, 1800s-ish, and he was one of the first to explicitly talk about emergence, which is a very important concept I'll discuss. We have Goethe, I don't actually know how to say his name, Goethe, who is better known, this is like 1700s, early 1800s, he's better known for his contributions to literature, but he did some interesting scientific work, which focused on form and organization over substance. So for instance, he was the one who coined the term morphology. And he even had this primitive notion of simulation. He had this idea, he wrote one book on plants. You'd watch a plant grow and you'd see sort of the pattern of what was happening, and he had this idea that you could then use your mind and use your visual and imaginative faculties and try to extrapolate what would happen next. They didn't have computers back then, so I guess that's the best that they could do. We have Immanuel Kant, who was the first to use the term self-organization and described an early version of what we now call autopoiesis, which is the notion that certain types of systems are self-making. That's what autopoiesis means. In that their parts exist by virtue of each other and can only be understood in the context of each other, as well as some function or purpose. We have Marcus Aurelius, who was actually an emperor of ancient Rome, wrote a fascinating little philosophical book called Meditations, which is incredibly rich and sophisticated in its understanding of Mariology, which is the study of whole-part relations. And what's one of the things that's interesting about it is how much of what we're now talking about that we think is new in terms of all this whole-part stuff was written back then. We have Heraclitus, ancient Greek philosopher, who came up with the aphorism, everything flows, early focus on the importance of dynamics. He also, I think he was the one who said you never step in the same river twice. And then, of course, inevitably, we end up with Aristotle. Usually it's Aristotle or Plato. Aristotle was the one who said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Actually, what he said was something closer to the whole can be different than the sum of its parts. And that has become somewhat of a mantra in the field of complexity. I personally have a hard time believing that all deep thought originated with the Greeks, even though it seems to always lead that way. I suspect that there was probably like a caveman or a cave woman back there who at some point had some of these similar thoughts, but just couldn't write it down. But I guess we won't know that. I just wanted to acknowledge that personal case. So as we try to get a handle on this complexity thing, maybe we can start with a definition. You look up the word complexity, and you get a state of being complex, which isn't really very helpful, is it? Then you look up complex, and the etymology comes from the Latin, complexus, meaning a totality comprised of a multitude of objects which are braided together, which are very intricately connected. There's a noun version of the word, which again refers to a whole of interrelated parts. And then there's also an adjective, which again talks about parts, but then also has this notion of being hard to separate or analyze or solve. And that's because these systems are so tightly integrated. They're hard to pull apart and understand. Then there's also this thing about complex numbers, which I don't think is directly relevant. But the key is that when we're talking about complexity, we're talking about complexes, the noun. Systems made up of parts in intricate and intimate relation. Now, some people have tried to come up with measures for complexity, and in the process of doing that, try to better define complexity. I was one of those people when I first got to Stanford. I started this project where I was going to come up with a measure of complexity. I should have known that it wouldn't have been very easy when I found out that Seth Lloyd at MIT had assembled a non-exhaustive list of 40 different possible measures and definitions of complexity. I'll go through just a couple of those. One of those is Kolmogorov complexity, now called algorithmic information content. And this is the idea that the complexity of something is the shortest possible description required to describe the system, usually expressed in terms of a program that could run on a universal computing machine. In effect, that means it would be a measure of the regularities in the system, how compressible that system is. Now, it's a useful idea because there is definitely an intuitive sense in which a more complex object would require a more complex description. But it falls short in two important respects. First, for a completely random system, the shortest possible description of the system is the system itself. There's no compressibility there. There's no regularity. And so, in effect, it equates complexity fully with randomness, which does not jive with our intuition. The second problem is for objects like fractals, the algorithmic information content is minimal. I mean, to generate the Mandelbrot set, you just use a very simple equation, iterate it. I actually don't agree that the Mandelbrot set is not a complex thing. I mean, if you've ever looked at it or explored it, you can zoom in to any infinite scale that you want, and you're always seeing different patterns and shapes and forms. And I think what this idea of algorithmic information content is missing is the generation of the object, its history. The Mandelbrot set isn't just an equation. It's that equation iterated over and over again and forming all these patterns and forms. So that's the generation history. So that's one approach. Another broad class of approaches is called discrete aspects approach. That's what I was calling it. And that's the idea that there is no one meaningful measure of complexity. Rather, there are different discrete aspects of complexity that should be measured separately. And so some of those are size, the size of the system, how many interacting parts there are. There's chaotic complexity, how nonlinear of a response do you get when you perturb the system. There's algorithmic complexity, which we just talked about, how unpredictable the system is, and so forth. So I tried to come up with my own measure, and I was thinking one possible approach would be something similar to the correlation coefficient that people use in cognitive science. And the idea is that IQ is just one. IQ tests are just one test, and it's not exactly certain what they measure. But there does seem to be this trend that if someone is good at one cognitive task, they'll be good at many, and you can measure the correlation between that. And so I was thinking of doing a sort of correlation measure among a bunch of different measures of complexity to come up with an overall measure. And then another approach would be this sort of multi-dimensional idea where I'd have a bunch of different axes, and I would come up with a measure that would be basically a vector, right, and incorporate all of them. So, one axis might be, is the system, can you predict what's going to happen with the system, or is it unpredictable? And complexity would probably be closer to here. Is it regular ordered, or is it random disordered? Complexity would probably be highest somewhere in the middle. Are there many distinct components, or just a few? Complexity would probably be higher here. And try to come up with some multi-dimensional measure. All the while keeping in mind that your scale and your perspective as an observer is critical. Because something that is complex on one scale can be very simple on another, or vice versa. And just as an example, if you look at a table, I mean, it doesn't seem to be very complex, but you zoom into that table and get at an atomic scale, and you see, atoms at planetary distances from each other jiggling around, and it's a whole different system. So, trying to come up with a complexity measure, you have to be very careful to be explicit about the fact that it's limited to whatever scale you're looking at. So then I was thinking about this stuff, I guess now I realize that trying to come up with a measure of complexity as a property is kind of missing the whole point. And people actually aren't really doing that much anymore. I personally got derailed when I started thinking about what the complexity of a pencil was. Probably because I had a pencil in my hand. So at first blush, it doesn't seem like a pencil would be very complex, right? Do you guys agree with that? I mean, looks like a pretty simple cylindrical object, right? And I guess like if you just think of it as a physical object cut off from the universe, then maybe that's true. But then I started thinking about, well, just the fact that that pencil exists means that writing exists. And that means that the complexity of it really has to include all the complexity of the writing, which of course implies that language exists. And of course somebody or something needs to speak that language, and that person exists in society with a culture that evolved. And so all of a sudden, this exploded out. And just the thought of the pencil by itself, it just seemed incredibly artificial and meaningless. This train of thought actually reminds me very much of a problem in biology, which is trying to define what is an individual. And I'll talk about a little example here, which I think is pretty fascinating. This is a little eukaryotic protist. It's called Mixotricha paradoxa. Paradoxa might give you a hint that something strange is going on. It's interesting because you find each of these cells in association with 5 species of bacteria. Most of these are spirochetes, which are found on the cell wall. And then one is an internal bacterium that lives inside this eukaryotic cell. Each of the spirochetes, of which there are about 250,000 on the cell wall per cell, each of those is associated with another anchoring bacteria that anchors it to the cell wall. All of these organisms form a sort of symbiotic superorganism. So basically, the spirochetes provide a propulsion system. The Mixotricha has these flagella here, but it just uses those to steer. And then the internal bacterium produces ATP. It basically plays the role of mitochondria. So Lynn Margulis pointed to this symbiosis as something like what the ancestral eukaryote might have been like. Eukaryotic cells, which are the same types of cells that we're made of, are basically colonies of bacteria. And even now, our mitochondria, which are at one point free-living bacteria, still retain bits of their original DNA, plasma DNA. So thinking about what constitutes an individual in this case is tricky, right?
I just want to make sure the people that don't have a biology background, there's a lot of terminology that Mark just used. Is anybody unclear about what the point he's trying to get across?
In general, stop me.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to raise your hand if you do, because I know there's a huge range of backgrounds in this audience, so it makes sense that somebody won't understand something some of the time.
Okay.
I don't believe you guys, but okay.
Are you following, Joel?
I'm following, but a year ago I wouldn't have been following, so.
It gets more out there, so. Okay, so tricky thinking about what an individual is here. But here's the crazier thing. Mixotricha paradoxa is actually a symbiote within the gut of termites. Or at least one species of termite lives in Australia. It can make up half the dry weight of this termite, half the dry weight. And they can't live without each other. The Mixotricha is what allows the termite to digest wood. So it's another symbiotic organism. What is the individual now? Where is the individual in this story? But the thing is that an individual termite is always found within the context of a colony. Individual worker termites cannot survive alone. Workers don't even reproduce. It's only the king and the queen of the colony that reproduce. So an individual termite in isolation doesn't really make sense. And of course, even termite colonies are not independent. They don't exist in a vacuum. They need rotten wood to survive. So the existence of the colony implies the existence of rotten wood. And of course, the existence of rotten wood implies the existence of trees, implies the existence of forests, implies the existence of ecosystems, implies the existence of a sun to provide. Go on. So I think fundamentally when we try to understand the world, we run into this tension. It's between simple ways of understanding and the complex reality. We can't really know reality itself because it's so connected, infinitely connected. But we can make mental models, and we can make scientific constructs which allow some level of understanding. The whole point of science, in fact, is to come up with simple explanations for complex phenomena. Now, traditionally, science has been way over to the left of this axis. I think what systems thinking and what the field of complexity, which is a brand of systems theory, has done through the development of a number of concepts and tools is to allow us to just inch a little bit closer to that complex reality. Now, along with this move has come a number of other shifts that I'll talk about in more detail. There has been a shift in focus from parts toward wholes, but not all the way to wholes. That would be just as skewed a perspective as just focusing on parts. There has been a shift from thinking in terms of atoms and substance to form and process. There has been a shift in focus on small numbers of things working in easy to understand mechanistic ways, and large numbers of things in working in ways that we can average or otherwise think of in statistical terms, to medium numbers of things made of things interacting in complex ways. There has also been a shift from equilibrium solutions in closed systems to steady state solutions in open systems. And most importantly, there has been a shift in linear thinking to nonlinear thinking. So I'll go through each of these and talk about some examples. First, I need to feed my brain more sugar. Caffeine.
Any questions so far?
Good time for questions. There has to be at least one question.
We won't go on until there's at least one question.
Okay.
Yes?
Yeah. This is just a clarification. So earlier you were talking about the different measures of complexity, and you said that for entropic systems, the simplest description of the system is the system itself.
For random.
Or yeah.
For random systems.
So what did you mean by that?
Well, if you're trying, so say you have a system and you're trying to describe the state of everything in that system, if there's some regularity there, then you don't have to describe where everything is because you have the regularity and you can extrapolate from that. If it's random, there's no regularity there, so to describe like say where every particle is in some system.
Mm-hmm.
If it's random, you just have to describe it. It's the system itself.
So another example is think about like a sine curve.
Mm-hmm.
You can describe, I can completely give you all the information about what the sine curve is going to do forever.
Mm-hmm.
If I tell you the amplitude, the frequency, and basically that's it. Now imagine I just sort of make a squiggly line and I do it for 10 years or something, and that's all I do, and I have this really long squiggly line. I can give you a picture of the first half of the squiggly line, and you can't tell me anything about the second half because there's no regularities. The only way I can fully describe that line to you is by giving you the whole picture or by giving you a list of all the different data points.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it means.
Thanks, Joel. Joel's going to be answering my questions.
Well, I think multiple perspectives.
No, it was great.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
very good explanation.
So you talked about complexity, measuring complexity. So that would be a sort of a function that takes like a pencil and spits out a number. Oh, this has complexity 5, and I put in a car, it's going to spit out complexity 10 or something like that. What's the purpose of it? Why do we need to compare complexities of different objects?
That's a good question. People, just for the sweet joy of quantification. I mean, for instance, like in biology, there's this at least there's a notion that there's been complexification throughout the course of evolution. Well, can you attach a concrete number to that complexification, just as an example?
I guess I have a comment on that. I did a research project studying like complexity in yeast. So we basically just had a qualitative scale where like, this is not very complex, this is very complex. But I guess my lab is looking for more quantitative ways to measure complexity, so you can automate it, make it a lot faster, and you won't have to add bias to your studies. Sorry. Yeah.
That's great. Yes?
Going back to the original question, what's an example of a completely random system?
I guess I always think of like a gas spread throughout a closed container. There's no structure there. It's just random. I don't know. Maybe I mean that's that's actually a deeper question because like, is there even such thing as anything random?
Right.
But imagine you have a crowd of people, you know, getting on the subway or something in Manhattan during rush hour. There's a lot of people doing a lot of different things there.
Right, but that's not totally random.
Well, what do you mean by totally random? I mean, this is a deep question.
yeah,
What is your sense of
I
randomness?
was just wondering if you had an example. Really.
What is your sense of randomness?
Completely random is you actually can't predict anything about it. There's no pattern anywhere. There's no.
Right. So this
There's
is
no like causal chain for like why you get from point A to point B. Sort of thing.
I mean, I think that's right.
So
whether that actually exists, like in nature, is another
Right.
question.
Or whether we just think that there's these random systems because we don't understand them, so thus we seem really random. But
and something we'll talk about later in the course is the idea that if something isn't really random, but it's close enough, meaning it's sort of crazy enough and has enough sort of chaos involved in it. We'll talk about what that means. Then you can model it as completely random, and you'll still get the same emergent properties or the same sort of global properties that you're really interested in. And there's some really interesting mathematical theorems that make that more formal. But that's a really reoccurring thing, that you can get large-scale structures, like how the ant colony behaves, without getting the small-scale structures, like the metabolism of each of the ants or something, completely correct. More often than not, you can take a simple model of that sort of complex thing and just say it's completely random, and you still get the same behavior on a global scale. But you're right. I mean, the question of are things really random is a deep one, and people might tell you quantum mechanics is really random. People might also be wrong. So
Einstein said God doesn't play dice. One more question.
So I'm following up on the random thing. I'm thinking if we can think of random system using second law of thermodynamics to define a random system as a system with the maximum entropy, so that it's in the most likely microstates.
Yeah.
Right. So
Well, that's
it's
one definition.
Oh, so that's a,
Yeah.
so I'm thinking, is that a definition for
I think so.
random?
yeah, people use the measure of entropy to measure randomness a lot in things outside of physics as well. But I also say something about this. Do you have a background in physics?
I took some physics class.
So the fact that most systems in the world aren't in equilibrium there's a lot of problems with that. And so the idea of entropy is founded in the idea that things are in equilibrium. So we'll talk more about that later.
Okay, let's go on. So one of the shifts that I mentioned is the shift from parts to wholes. And this is related to a long-standing distinction between reductionism and holism. Reductionism, or at least one aspect of reductionism, is the belief that the best way to understand a thing or process is to take it apart and try to understand its pieces, which often means taking those pieces apart to try to understand those pieces, and so on, all the way down. An underlying assumption is that once we understand the pieces, we will be able to put them back together in a simple additive way and reconstruct and understand the whole. So an example of a reductionist approach can be found in physics, where first we found atoms, and then in an effort to understand atoms, we discovered subatomic particles like electrons, neutrons, and protons. Proteins, as a biologist. Then, of course, we discovered quarks and leptons, and maybe now strings. We're not really sure where or if that will end. In biology, neuroscientists tried to understand mind and behavior by first looking at brains, then looking at different regions within brains, then looking at individual neurons, then looking at ion channels, individual molecules within neurons, and so forth. The reductionist approach has been enormously successful. It's actually defined science for most of its history. But it's run into some limitations. And so, for instance, in the case of physics, it turns out that as we get to the smallest scales, we no longer really encounter things, we encounter quantum mechanical probabilities. As we get into subatomic realms, particles don't really have any meaning as isolated entities. They can only be understood as interconnections or correlations among various processes of measurement and observation. So, as Werner Heisenberg described the situation, the world thus appears as a complicated tissue of events in which connections of different kinds alternate or overlap or combine, thereby determining the texture of the whole. A second problem with that physics reductionist approach is that we, or any other macroscopic object, is not just a bunch of atoms or quarks or whatever. The critical missing ingredient is the organization of those parts. To use a popular term from another era, the organized complexity. Incidentally, Heisenberg saw the shift from parts to wholes as so critical that he titled his scientific autobiography, Apart from the Whole. In the case of the study of mind, I couldn't attribute the quote, but I think this pretty well sums it up. Only a fool would look for consciousness in a microscope. A single neuron may look smart. I mean, it's got all its fancy dendrites and axons and stuff. But it takes many neurons organized in particular ways to lead to conscious thought. On the other hand, an extreme holistic approach is just as misguided. A holistic approach holds that systems are irreducibly complex and can only be understood in their totality. An example would be like Gestalt psychology, the early part of the 1900s. That is a dead-end track, that belief, and has proved false. Just think about how much we've learned about molecular biology and genetics, specifically by taking cells apart. So at this point, I'm going to introduce two concepts important in the field of complexity that offer a way to integrate reductionist and holistic approaches. The first is the holon. That's a term introduced by Arthur Koestler in 1967, a book called Ghost of the Machine. It's a notion, well, a holon is a thing or process that is simultaneously both a part and a whole. And it's a notion that recognizes the hierarchical nature of nature. And that many times, maybe all the time, because I can't really think of exceptions, elements in this hierarchy are both wholes composed of lower level parts and parts of higher level wholes. So, for example, I've got a biological hierarchy here. I've got cells, which are wholes comprised of molecules, but they're also parts of tissues. Tissues are wholes comprised of cells, but they're parts of organs. Organs, wholes comprised of tissues, parts of organisms. Another example would be, say, words, which are wholes comprised of letters, but are parts of sentences, which are wholes comprised of words, but are parts of paragraphs, and so forth. You can think of a million different examples. Complexity approach always keeps this duality in mind. Study parts with the whole in mind, and vice versa. And also remember that these holons interact hierarchically as well as laterally. Organisms don't just interact with organs, organisms are interacting with organisms over here. So there's this hierarchy, and there's a lateral interaction. The second concept, which is actually related in a way, and I would say this is the critical concept in complexity, is emergence. This is from a book by Roger Lewin, that was called Complexity. The idea here is that simple local interactions between parts can lead to the emergence of some global structure or process or state, and that state then can feedback, and we'll describe this now in terms of constraints, and then constrain what these parts are able to do. So there's this sort of dialectic. This whole, which is greater than or different than these parts, and this sort of feedback process. I'll give you some examples to try to flesh this out a little bit. Early universe, We just had the Big Bang, nothing but a hot plasma. Eventually, electrons, neutrons, protons condensed out when the temperature fell enough. But now they're just zipping around, they're kind of doing what they want. They're not very much constrained. But the temperature goes down a little more, and they start to interact in particular ways that create a specific structure, which is the atom. Okay? Once you have electrons, protons, and neutrons within that atom structure, an electron can't do whatever it wants. It needs to exist within a specific orbital. So although an atom is in a sense nothing more than electrons and protons and neutrons, it's something different. It's this greater structure, and it has an effect, or at least a perceived effect, of constraining what the parts do. I'll give you another example. You can think of this in terms of these are molecules in the cell, and they interact in particular ways, particular organization, and you get life. Once you have a living cell, what these molecules are going to do is very different than what they would do, say, in a petri dish. Another example. These could be ants. Each individual ant is kind of an idiot. But together, through the local interactions, you can get this colony-level behavior that is actually quite adaptive. It allows ant colonies to survive. Last example, people use this concept when thinking about these could be neurons interacting to their connections, different electrical impulses, and you get thought and mind arising out of this. Related to this notion of emergence is this idea of decentralized control. You can think of these constraints as providing a sort of control for the system. And so like in the case of ant colonies, there's nobody in charge in an ant colony. There's an ant that we call the queen. Grandiose name. She sits in a burrow and she lays eggs. There's nobody guiding the show. But the individual ants are interacting in such a way that that control emerges from their actions. Decentralized. Another related concept is self-organization. That's the idea that order and pattern can arise simply from the interactions of parts using local information. Example, you have networks of neurons that spontaneously couple to produce synchronized patterns of activation. They're just using the information from the cells that they are connected to. And the same thing, maybe Lou could be interested in this stuff. Same thing with fireflies. You can see some spectacular synchronized light shows of fireflies in Asia, where each firefly is only responding to its closest neighbors. They can't even see like miles down away where the show ends. All synchronized.
Bird flocks are another example.
Bird flocks.
Be a more common one that we see every day. Especially really big bird flocks.
Actually, if anybody have any other examples? It's a nice exercise.
Schools of fish.
Schools of
Yeah.
fish. Collective behavior in general. There's nobody in charge in the school of fish. It's decentralized control. Every time they move, if you watch them, every time they move, there's a new fish in the front. Okay. I really think that concept is probably the key, and then it connects with all these other things. And also, you can think of these holons in terms of emergence, in that these tissues are basically this emerging global structure from the interactions of cells. And what a cell is going to do, like say in development, depends on what tissue is already there. So you have that feedback and that constraint. You can think of each of these levels, each of these two levels, as basically one of these. Okay. Another important shift associated with systems and complexity thinking has been this movement from atoms and substance, focus on atoms and substance, call it conceptions of eternal truth, towards form and process, which we can also rephrase as context and dynamics, or more generally as contingency. So a key theme here is the importance of context in setting the meaning of a system, of any constituent part within a system. What do I mean by that? Well, you can think about a word as an atom on the rest of the sentence that's in. So same word, I like to eat dates, I went on a few dates, I can't remember the dates, very different meanings. Same thing, interestingly enough, with the genes. That's why I put the gene in quotes here. What does any individually protein coding gene mean? The whole idea of genes for things is a bit suspect, because often what a gene is for can depend critically on its context. And here's one of my favorite examples, lactose dehydrogenase. This can be an enzyme, right? Or depending on when or where it's expressed, it can be a key component, structural component of the eye. What is the gene lactose dehydrogenase for? Or let's think about, actually, let's go to another key theme that's related to all this, contingency and dynamics. And think about atoms literally, like actual atoms that we learn about in chemistry and physics. We think of atoms as timeless, right? But that's not true. Right after the Big Bang, which I mentioned before, there were no atoms. It was just this super hot plasma. Atoms condensed as the plasma cooled. And even so, the first atoms were very light. It was basically just hydrogen. Heavier elements, like the ones that make up our bodies, only arose much later by nuclear fusion in stars, which formed contingently on the expansion and gravitational gradients of the whole universe. So my point is that even atoms, which are like the quintessential eternal things, are contingent objects dependent on dynamics across massive scales. All right, back to the theme of context. Thinking about the importance of form and pattern, thinking about atoms. I mean, say we have an element, we have hydrogen. What is hydrogen? Even like how it appears, what form it appears in, depends very much on its context. So it can show up as a flammable gas or as a solid or a liquid depending on temperature. It can be oxidized as water, or it can be in the form of a star, or it can be a constituent of us. The main point, the focus of complexity isn't on atoms in the broad sense of the word, but on what happens when you put them together in a dynamic and contingent context. So this was just kind of a fun thought. Organismal development itself is like the ultimate expression of a form, process, contingency, and dynamics. You can ask yourself, what is the human atom? You can imagine like an alien comes down and he wants a human for his collection. Which is the human atom that he should pick? Is it the adult? Or maybe it's an old person? Or maybe you should get a child or an infant? Does a fetus count? Or how about a sperm or an egg? And does one count, or do you need both? And which stage goes to heaven? The point is that being human itself is a process. And this goes back to Heraclitus, who I mentioned earlier. Everything is flow. We're going to move on to another shift. Traditionally, science has dealt most successfully with small numbers of things and large numbers of things, not with medium numbers. When you have small numbers of things, they can be understood in explicitly mechanistic models. So we're all familiar with these types of cartoons from like a molecular biology text. Very simple mechanistic interaction model. Got it, right? With large numbers, assuming a closed system and that parts are sufficiently similar that the differences can cancel out or average, we can use statistics. So for example, we can talk about things like temperature, which is just average molecular motion. But what happens when you get the similar units interacting in mechanistic ways, and what you're interested in is the form or the pattern rather than the statistic? There are too many interactions to keep track of, like in a simple cartoon, but the statistic is meaningless. So I'm talking about things like development, for instance, where it's the pattern of gene expression that determines everything. And I'm talking about things like brain behavior, or brain patterns of brain activity, which correlate to thought. And that is the realm of organized complexity. Another shift has been from a focus on closed systems and equilibrium solutions to open systems and dynamic steady state solutions. And this is important because in reality, all systems are open to some extent. The emphasis on open systems was a large theme in Bernoulli's general systems theory, by the way. So in a system closed to material or to energetic flux, the second law of thermodynamics states that entropy should increase. So what is entropy? In any spontaneously occurring natural process, usable energy decreases. So for example, in engines, this energy is lost in the form of dissipated heat. Entropy can also be thought of in terms of probabilities and order. In closed systems, order tends to decrease over time. So we'll go through, what's that?
Say decrease or increase?
What did I say? Order tends to decrease.
Order tends to decrease.
Disorder increases.
Does everybody understand the difference between closed and open system? Any questions about that? When I say closed, we literally mean isolated from any matter getting in, any energy getting in. There's no heat can get out, and etc.
Here's an example of closed system and entropy. We start off with a gradient of something. It can be, I don't know, we can think of it as gas. Now that gradient represents a form of order, and we can use gradients to do work. That's actually the energetic tie-in, right? You can have voltage gradients, you can have pressure gradients, you can use those to do work. With time, the gas will spread into, you'll lose that initial order. We'll get some sort of uniform random state. Why does that happen? You can think of it in terms of mechanistic terms. The molecules are bouncing off each other, spreading through the system. Or you can think of it in terms of probability. There are just many more states that this system could exist in than this initial ordered one. It's always possible that you could move in the reverse direction, but it's just improbable to the point of never happening. I mean, like, you crash, you smash a bottle, it generally, or never, will just spontaneously reset. In theory, entropy is increasing in the entire universe. And eventually we're going to end up with a homogeneous state of nothing much. It's very sad. But then, whence comes all the order around us? Like us, for instance. At least in certain pockets of the universe, it seems that order is increasing. This brings up the notion of dissipative structures, which is a concept associated with Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine. The idea is that in open systems, flows of energy or matter within a certain range, not too little, not too much, can amplify nonlinear relations between parts of the system and lead to dynamic, stable states of order. The overall entropy is still increasing since the energy is being dissipated into the environment. So we're still in accordance with the second law of thermodynamics, but local organization can increase. So I'll go through a few examples. Here's a whirlpool funnel, say in a bathtub. It's driven far from equilibrium just by the force of gravity. Equilibrium in a bathtub, by the way, that's just calm water. Driven far from equilibrium until you get, until the force of gravity and centrifugal forces balance each other and create this relatively stable structure. I mean, you can poke a finger in it and it will persist, it's robust. A candle flame is another example. It's fed by the energy of its burning wax. It dissipates that energy as heat, and it's relatively stable. With a little bit of wind, and it won't go out. It'll blow pretty hard. Here's another example. These are Bernard cells. This is just a very thin layer of oil, and you add heat, gradually increase the heat, and at a critical point, you get this pattern. And all this represents is basically the most efficient way to dissipate that heat, given those conditions. So I'd like you to notice that these are system-level regularities. The components, meaning the water or the oil, are constantly cycling through, but the pattern and the form are persistent. Living things, including us, are far from equilibrium structures in this sense. We extract food from the food we eat to fuel our maintenance and our growth, and we dissipate that energy as heat and excrement, and it's our pattern and our form that are constant, not the molecules that comprise us. We cycle through like every atom in our body every few years. Think about that for a minute. Okay, so now moving on to the last and the most important shift, I think, is a shift from linear additive thinking to nonlinear network thinking. So the word linear refers to straight lines, whether we're talking mathematically in a graphical sense or thinking in terms of linear causation. This leads to that in a simple manner. And the idea with linear thinking is you can just add up independent results of component parts and understand the system. Nonlinear means that the output of the structure or the system is not going to be directly proportional to the input or have a direct line of causation. And this is often because of coupled relationships, like variables that are not independent, interactions that are not direct lines, and things like phase transitions. So for example, you heat water. Initially, the temperature rises gradually, linearly, but at a critical threshold, the water boils into a gas. You get a completely qualitatively different state. So linear thinking can work fine in some cases. In others, it gets us into trouble. Like when you try to approach something like the chicken and the egg paradox in a linear fashion. Which came first? I mean, obviously, eggs have to come before chickens, right? But then you need the chickens to lay the eggs. The solution to the paradox is pretty easy. It's just recognizing a circular causal process. And circular causality, by the way, is okay. It's not circular reasoning, which is not okay. Chickens lead the eggs, lead the chickens, or you can think of it as eggs lead the chickens, lead the eggs, whatever you like. Neither is primary, okay? Circular causality, yes?
How is circular causality different from circular thinking?
Circular thinking, I'm not sure the best way to answer that question. Circular thinking, you're not starting from any axioms and determining the truth. You're not proving anything.
But how is that proving something?
This isn't proving anything. This is just a mechanism. And actually it's not this process. I'll show you what it really is, and then we can go back to that question. Any other questions? So circular causality provides an entryway into understanding feedback, a la cybernetics, which is causing the temperature to remain at a set point in the system. Is it the thermostat or is it the furnace? I mean, it's basically the same thing. Of course, it's both. And this is a simple feedback loop. In this case, this is a negative feedback loop. The sensor has a set goal, and if the temperature drops below that set goal, it activates the furnace, and you end up with a homeostatic system and some stable temperature. You could have it such that the furnace turned on when the thermostat sensed that the temperature was at its set point, and then it stayed on, so you end up with greater and greater deviation. That would be a form of positive feedback. It's also called runaway feedback or vicious circle. And that's not sustainable. Positive feedback is not sustainable. It leads to things like chain reactions and nuclear explosions. It leads to unsustainable growth, and or maybe just using a lot of gas. Eventually, it's always constrained by something. Although it can be a driver for change. Like it definitely creates movement towards something, and maybe that's a different stable state. Yes?
What does homeostatic mean?
It just means stable, around a certain point. Like our temperature, usually use it in terms of biology, our temperature is homeostasis, just a fancy word. Same state is literally what it means, homeostasis. Okay.
Can I say one thing about the question that was asked about the difference? In both of these systems, the parts that are sort of getting fed back on each other are dynamic systems. They're changing. The heater's changing its settings, and the thermostat's responding by telling it to turn off. And the chicken, the egg, in that case, you think about as an evolutionary process. And there's there's a different organism before, and it's changing while the egg's changing, and that's causing the chicken to change. So the point is they're dynamic. If you're talking about circular reasoning, the two things you have there are two logical statements which aren't changing. And then you're just going in a circle. But in this case, you're sort of going in a spiral, because you're going in a circle, but the whole thing is changing at the same time.
You just stole my thunder. But yeah.
We did not coordinate this.
That's exactly right. I mean, the true solution to this paradox is more interesting, because before the chicken and the egg, there's an unbroken chain of causality, and you had, reptiles and eggs, and amphibians and eggs, and fish and eggs, and worms and eggs, and so forth, all the way back down. And probably, maybe from the Big Bang. It's an evolutionary process. It's a developmental process. And the thing is that you see this in most, if not all, complex systems. They don't just arise fully formed. They develop through time. So this form of causality, I think, is very important. I'm glad you agree, though.
I'm glad you agree.
More generally, when you're looking at your little slice of the universe, studying whatever, and you see like a linear interaction, this leads to that, it's important to keep in mind the greater context, and that if you just extend your view a little bit, you may see some more complex relations, and it may even turn out to be some sort of like circular causality. So I'd like to go through an example of how all this complex systems thinking can be applied to better understand a system that has traditionally been thought of in more linear terms. And many possibilities to choose from. I'm a biologist. I'm going to choose genetics. And I'm going to deconstruct what's been called the central dogma of molecular biology. First of all, I mentioned that I don't think there is any place for the word dogma in rational discourse. Leave that to religions. Here's the central dogma. Basically, it says that there's a one-way information flow that goes from DNA through transcription to RNA, through translation to proteins. We're on the far left of our simplicity to complexity axis here. To the point of being, if not wrong, then cartoonishly incomplete. We're in one of our little limited boxes of causality. The fact is that DNA doesn't do anything by itself. It's an inert molecule. The whole transcription and translation process is entirely dependent on the existence of proteins, which are the molecular machinery that do stuff in cells. So we're back to that kind of thing. That's not to mention the necessity of a metabolism to provide energy for the process. It's not to mention a bunch of feedbacks from different levels of organization, like you can have what's called epigenetic modifications of DNA, like methylation, which inactivate the DNA. That's environmentally influenced. That's not to mention the fact that what a gene does, what it means to the system, as I already talked about, is contextual. It does not consider the fact that one gene can code for many protein products through something called alternative splicing. So this won't be just one protein, this could be many, depending on what's already happening out there. And it doesn't acknowledge one of the most important aspects of metabolism and development, which is gene regulation. We share 98%, roughly, of our sequence identity of our protein coding genes with chimps. It turns out most of the differences between the two species are in regulatory stretches of DNA, which determine when and where the genes are active, not in the protein coding sections. So, speaking of what genes do, I think there's still this predominant misconception in genetics, at least in popular culture, where we're stuck in this Mendelian paradigm, where one gene codes for one protein, codes for one trait, the linear way.
If you take that far enough, you get to things like the fat gene, the gay gene, and all these crazy ideas that are completely wrong.
If you just take one thing away, just take that it's not that simple. Okay.
Yeah.
We have approximately 20,000 genes coding for the human body. For the human, not just our body. But we're made up of something like 50 trillion cells, right? And that's not to mention like maybe an order of magnitude more bacteria, which are in our guts and elsewhere, which turn out to be more than just hangers-on. There are like all kinds of crazy symbioses going each of these trillions of cells is itself an incredibly complex, and all the complex proteins, as well as its external structure. Like think about a neuron and all of its complex architectures and its fancy axons and its dendrites. And all these cells are organized at other levels of organization into integrated tissue systems. Like here, this is the vascular system of a kidney. And the point is, if you try to draw a linear line of causation from genes to phenotype, you're screwed. There simply are not enough genes to contain nearly enough information for a one-to-one blueprint type mapping of code to phenotype. And if you guys, for those of you that took Sapolsky's class, he alluded to this kind of thing. Yes?
So my understanding of DNA is that it's just a bunch of base pairs. And then you say, okay, this is a gene, this is a gene, this is a gene. But if you say each gene doesn't correspond one-to-one to a particular phenotype, then how do you decide a bunch of base pairs correspond to a single gene? Am I totally
No, that's a good question. The question of what a gene is not as closed as maybe some textbooks would like you to believe. But typically, you differentiate a protein coding gene. There's a particular stretch of DNA that codes for one protein or some family of proteins, and that's what we call genes typically. Did I answer the question?
Yeah.
So if the 20,000 genes can't have enough information in this simple, linear way, then how can it possibly work? If you can think in terms of the way that I've been describing, with hierarchies of emergent structures and processes arising out of the nonlinear interactions of components, thinking of the genome as a nonlinear network where genes operate as agents according to simple local rules, then I think that offers a way forward. And I'll try to make that a little more concrete. One way to think about this is in terms of fractal development. I think I heard that term from Sapolsky. Anyway, fractals are self-similar objects across scales. They're built, at least mathematically, using very simple rules iterated over and over. And hence you build similar structures across scales as they grow. Okay? Now look at the branching patterns of dendrites and axons in a nerve cell. Each nerve cell can be connected to 1,000 other nerve cells. Think about the number of different branch points there, the amount of information needed to create them all. And then that's just one scale within the body. Think about the entire circulatory system and all the bajillions of little branch points there. How can you code for that in a one-to-one way with so few genes? It's hard to see how you can do that. Not to mention all the other complexities of the body. That's just like one angle. But if all you need is to encode when branch points tend to happen, right, according to, say, some molecular gradient as bodies are developing, then you can begin to see how just a few genes and iterated developmental processes can start to give rise to incredibly complex emergent structures. So, what we are going to be doing in this class is to look at how we can start to formally represent the types of ideas that I've been describing. We will look at how to build fractals, and we'll explore the power laws that are used to describe their self-similar structure, scale-free structure. We will look at the primary language of the field of complexity, which is in terms of networks of interacting elements rather than linear relations. We'll study both static descriptions of networks and dynamic networks. And as far as the difference there, the brain is basically a static network of neurons. Thoughts come from the energetic dynamics through that network. We will look at dynamical systems theory, including chaos. In a nutshell, chaos is the lesson that in a deterministic system of simple coupled relations, you can get extremely complex behavior that's hard to distinguish from randomness and that is exquisitely sensitive to initial conditions. and which furthermore, very interestingly, chaos is kind of a misnomer, it may contain hidden order when examined in particular ways, like looking at it in phase space. We'll talk about what that is and how to do that. And finally, we're going to look at some agent-based modeling techniques, including cellular automata, which again show how simple components can interact to produce complicated outputs, and which furthermore allow us to study the pattern and form that result. And our goal is to demystify some of these concepts and to understand them in more rigorous mathematical terms. None of us are experts. We're here to learn from each other, and it should be a fun ride. And that's what I've got. So, thank you.